On the surface was a town like countless others scattered across America's vast landscape. Nestled between rolling hills and thick woodlands, it thrived on routine and familiarity. The mornings began with the smell of coffee drifting from the corner, and evenings ended with porch lights glowing warmly along tree-lined streets. It was the kind of town where neighbors waved to one another, even if they didn't know each other's names, and where gossip traveled faster than the mail. Life here was steady, predictable, and safe. At least, that's what everyone believed. Amid this quiet backdrop lived Dawson. To most, she was little more than a pleasant but unremarkable figure. She worked shifts at Millie's Diner on Main Street, where she poured coffee with a polite smile and remembered regulars' orders without needing to write them down. The truck drivers who stopped by after long hauls knew her as the lady with the calm voice. Teenagers from the high school sometimes teased each other about who had the courage to strike up a conversation with her. Yet none of them could say they knew her well. Lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, tucked away near the woods. From the outside, her life appeared simple: gardening in the spring, fishing in the summer, chopping wood in the fall, and keeping to herself during the long winters. She wasn't unfriendly. She attended town fairs, lent books from the library, and nodded politely when greeted on the street. But she kept her world carefully measured, offering just enough warmth to avoid suspicion and never enough to invite deeper questions. The townspeople filled in the blanks themselves. Some guessed she had moved there after a divorce. Others thought she'd grown tired of city life and retreated for peace. A few whispered that maybe she had lost someone. Her eyes, after all, carried a quiet sorrow when she thought no one was watching, yet nobody pressed her for answers. In a town like, people respected privacy, at least on the surface, even as speculation ran wild behind closed doors. But there was something about that never quite fit the picture. For one, she carried herself differently. Even in her diner uniform, she moved with a deliberate grace, as if every step and gesture had been calculated in advance. When she reached for a coffee pot or balanced a tray, it wasn't clumsy or rushed. It was precise, efficient. Observant folks noticed how her eyes scanned a room without seeming to, how she always chose a seat near exits at community gatherings, and how she rarely let her back face an open space. Some chalked it up to a cautious personality. Others barely noticed at all. After all, who would expect a story worth telling to come from Dawson? She was background, a fixture of normalcy, someone to smile at and forget once the door closed behind you. Yet beneath her quiet exterior was a history no one could have imagined. Years earlier, had lived a life that demanded absolute discipline, one that left little room for mistakes. She had walked deserts where shadows meant survival, breathed air thick with danger, and learned the kind of patience that could mean the difference between life and death. She had been taught by a man whose name stirred respect in military circles, a sniper whose shots had altered the course of battles overseas. Had been his student, and eventually his equal. But knew nothing of that. They saw only the surface, a woman who listened more than she spoke, who never raised her voice, and who seemed content to exist in the quiet margins of their little world. And that suited just fine. The last thing she wanted was attention. What no one realized was that life had become a waiting game. She wasn't seeking conflict, nor was she eager to relive the intensity of her past. But she had trained too long, too hard, to ever let go completely. Skills like hers didn't vanish. They slept. And whether she admitted it or not, she lived with the knowledge that someday, somehow, she might be forced to awaken them again. For now remained peaceful. The children played safely in the park, the church bells rang on Sundays, and the townspeople whispered idle gossip about crops and weather. Walked among them quietly, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to. She was invisible by design. And yet deep inside, the soldier in her never slept. She carried a stillness that was more than habit. It was readiness. It was the coiled tension of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and knew how quickly peace could shatter. Thought of her as the quiet stranger, the woman at the diner with kind eyes. They had no clue that the stranger they overlooked would one day hold their lives in her hands. Dawson's past was a puzzle no one in had ever solved. If asked, she would smile politely, give a vague answer, and change the subject. People assumed she had nothing worth telling. In truth, her silence wasn't forgetfulness but choice, a deliberate wall to keep her old life buried. Years before she stepped into Millie's diner with her soft voice and calm smile, lived a life where hesitation could cost everything. She had been shaped by the tutelage of one man, Sergeant Victor Hale, a Marine sniper whose name was spoken with reverence among soldiers. Hale wasn't just a marksman, he was a legend, the kind of figure whispered about in barracks and training camps, where recruits studied his exploits like scripture. Hale's reputation was carved in deserts and mountains far from home, in battles where his presence alone tilted the scales. Young and restless, found herself under his wing. He saw in her what few others noticed, a steadiness in her hands, an uncanny patience in her eyes. Where others twitched with nerves, held still. Where others rushed, she waited. Hale believed she could become more than a soldier, she could become a shadow. Training with him was brutal. Days began before sunrise, when the world was still wrapped in silence, and ended long after the last light had vanished. Lay in fields for hours unmoving, her body aching as bugs crawled over her skin. She learned to slow her breathing until it was almost imperceptible, to steady her heartbeat until even fear couldn't shake it. Hale would whisper lessons as they waited, lessons about wind, distance, light, and patience. "It's not about pulling the trigger," he told her once, his eyes fixed through a scope. "It's about knowing when not to." Under his guidance, mastered more than marksmanship. She learned how to vanish in plain sight, how to blend with the terrain, how to anticipate her enemy's mind before they moved. She learned endurance, not just of the body but of the spirit. Hale drilled into her a principle she carried for life. A true sniper's weapon isn't the rifle, it's discipline. But discipline came at a cost. The work was lonely, isolating, existed in silence for long stretches, often invisible even to her fellow soldiers. She became comfortable with being unseen, with observing rather than speaking, with letting others underestimate her. That habit, born of necessity, would one day define her life in. Her missions were rarely celebrated, often classified, sometimes entirely. Carried the weight of actions no one outside the field would ever understand. There were victories she couldn't claim, sacrifices she couldn't share, and regrets that haunted her in the quiet hours of the night. Though she never spoke of it, there were moments she replayed in her mind, faces she remembered, choices she questioned. After years in the field, the day came when walked away. It wasn't a dramatic exit, no grand farewell. She simply chose peace over war. She had given her best years to service, absorbed Hale's lessons, and paid the price in silence. Became her refuge, a place to fade into the background, to trade rifles for coffee pots and for quiet streets. Yet the past never fully released her. Even as she wiped counters in the diner, she caught herself scanning doorways, noting exits, assessing strangers. When she walked the forest trails near her home, her senses remained tuned, ears alert for shifts in the wind, eyes catching movement others overlooked. She wasn't paranoid, she was prepared, always prepared. Hale's voice lingered in her memory, firm and unyielding. "The moment you forget what you are capable of, the world will remind you." Never forgot, she simply chose not to remind anyone else. She was invisible, just another quiet resident. But in truth, she was something far more dangerous. Her past wasn't a story she had left behind. It was a shadow that followed her, silent and patient, waiting for the day it would matter again. The townspeople thought they lived beside a woman who had fled from some private sorrow. They could never have guessed the truth, that she had been trained by one of America's deadliest snipers, and that if danger ever came, the quiet stranger among them would be the one person capable of standing against it. That day was closer than anyone realized. The summer evening unfolded like countless others in. The town park buzzed with life, a scene painted in warm colors and simple joys. Children darted across the grass with dripping popsicles, teenagers clustered near the fountain trading jokes, and parents lounged under the pavilion with plates of barbecue. A local band played on a small stage, their music carrying through the humid air. It was one of those nights when peace seemed unshakable, when the town's troubles felt no larger than a missed grocery item or a flat tire. Sat on the edge of the gathering sipping lemonade. She hadn't planned on staying long, social events were never her favorite, but something about the laughter and music tugged at her. It reminded her of everything she'd chosen for, the simplicity, the sense of safety, the illusion that the world's darker edges couldn't reach this far. For once, she allowed herself to relax. Then the sound came, not music, not laughter, the low, rumbling growl of engines. From the road beyond the park, headlights cut through the evening like sudden knives. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into view, their tinted windows reflecting the last streaks of sunset. At first, people assumed it was nothing unusual, maybe out-of-towners, maybe a visiting sports team, but the vehicles didn't slow. They pulled up along the edge of the park in a formation that was deliberate, disciplined. Doors swung open, and the illusion of safety shattered. Men poured out, heavily armed, their movements sharp and coordinated. These weren't reckless criminals, they carried themselves with training, with confidence. Their rifles gleamed under the park lights. The music faltered, then stopped altogether, replaced by startled gasps and screams. Within moments, the attackers took control of the crowd, their voices booming commands laced with menace. "On the ground," one barked, shoving a man back toward the pavilion. Another herded children toward a corner, his weapon sweeping in warning arcs. Mothers clutched their sons and daughters close, trying to shield them with their own bodies. Fathers raised their hands, faces tight with helpless rage. The carefree cookout transformed into a nightmare in seconds. Didn't move. She stayed seated, her lemonade cup frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes narrowing. Every instinct she had buried for years snapped awake, sharp and unyielding. She counted them, 6, maybe 7 men dressed in dark clothing, carrying advanced rifles that civilians had no business owning. Their leader, tall and cold-eyed, issued orders with clipped precision. This wasn't random. This was organized. The crowd panicked, some trying to flee, only to be shoved back at gunpoint. Phones dialed 911, but the attackers had planned well. A large pickup blocked the main road into town, buying them precious time before authorities could arrive. The hostages were beneath the pavilion, forced to kneel as weapons loomed above them. His heartbeat slowed, not quickened. It was the old rhythm returning, the steady calm she had been trained for, the one that surfaced in the eye of chaos. While everyone else trembled, she observed. She studied their patterns, who covered the crowd, who scanned the perimeter, who acted as the leader. She noticed details others missed, the way one gunman's grip trembled slightly, betraying nerves, the way another favored his left leg, revealing an old injury, weaknesses, angles. To the attackers was invisible, just another frightened civilian lost in the crowd. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. She knew that every second counted, that if she did nothing, blood would spill before help could ever cut through the blocked roads. She lowered her cup, set it silently on the bench, and exhaled. The choice she had avoided for years loomed in front of her. She could stay the quiet stranger, fading into the chaos like everyone else. Or she could let the shadows of her past return, unleashing the skills that no one knew she possessed. Her fingers flexed unconsciously, as if remembering the weight of a rifle. Her eyes tracked the nearest exit routes, the possible vantage points. She had no weapon yet, but she didn't need one to know what had to happen. The attackers believed they had complete control. They had no idea that among the hostages sat a woman trained by a man, whose legend was built on turning the tide of impossible battles. And Dawson had just decided she would not let fall. The park had transformed into a cage of fear. Children whimpered against their mothers' shoulders. Fathers clenched their jaws in helpless frustration, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with panic. Every sudden movement drew the sharp attention of a rifle barrel, and every command from the armed men cut like a whip. But in the middle of the storm, Dawson remained utterly still. Her eyes moved, not her body. She studied the enemy with the precision of a surgeon cataloging details that would be invisible to anyone else. 7 men in total. The leader barked commands, confident, ruthless. 2 stayed near the crowd, sweeping their rifles across the trembling hostages. Another patrolled the perimeter, scanning nervously for interference. The remaining 3 circled near the vehicles, securing their escape route. Noted their weapons, Yar-style rifles, all well maintained. Their stances revealed they had training, military or mercenary, not amateurs. But training had its flaws too. They were overconfident, convinced their firepower and tactics guaranteed control. That arrogance blinded them to the smallest details, the kind saw instantly. The leader's men were disciplined, but not disciplined enough. One kept checking his phone, distracted. Another adjusted his grip too often, betraying nerves. She inhaled slowly, letting her body fall into the rhythm she had practiced for years. Fear was natural, but fear could be tamed. Her heartbeat slowed to a steady thrum, her breathing measured and calm. Around her, people shivered in terror, but pulse moved as if she were sitting in her own living room. Patience, she reminded herself, not yet. The key to survival wasn't immediate action, it was timing. If she struck too soon, she'd risk the lives of everyone in the pavilion. But if she waited too long, the attackers might decide to make an example of someone. And once that first life was taken, the rest would follow. Shifted her gaze toward the crowd. A boy no older than 10 clung to his mother's sleeve, his small face buried in her arm. His sobs were muffled, but his trembling shoulders gave him away. One of them noticed, stepping closer with a cruel smirk. He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at the child, as if daring the mother to protest. Decision crystallized. Her mind raced through possibilities. She had no weapon here, not yet, but she knew where one was. Her pickup sat parked just beyond the tree line. Inside, beneath a blanket, was her hunting rifle. Nothing special to the untrained eye, but in her hands it was as precise as the sniper rifles she had once carried overseas. The problem was getting there unnoticed. She let her body sag, mimicking the posture of the frightened crowd. She kept her eyes downcast, her movements small and unremarkable. She was just another hostage, frozen in fear. Slowly, carefully, she began edging backward, sliding one step at a time toward the shadows beyond the pavilion. The noise of crying children and the barked orders covered the sound of her retreat. Her heart stayed steady. 1 step, pause, 2 steps, pause. She was invisible, a ghost in plain sight, just as Hale had taught her years ago. Within minutes, melted into the tree line. From there she moved quickly, her caution giving way to silent urgency. She reached her truck, slipped inside, and pulled the rifle free. The cool metal felt familiar in her hands, too familiar. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself, remembering every lesson drilled into her until it had become second nature. It's not about the shot, Hale's voice echoed in her memory. It's about the choice. She climbed onto a low rooftop overlooking the park, belly pressed flat against the shingles. Through her scope, the chaos sharpened into clarity. She found the boy first, the terrified child still clutching his mother. Then she shifted her aim to the man threatening him. Exhaled. In the middle of the storm, she was calm. The townspeople believed they were defenseless. They believed they had control. Both were wrong. The woman they thought they knew, the quiet waitress from the diner, was gone. In her place was the shadow Hale had forged, the sniper hidden within. Dawson was ready to act. Body hugged the rooftop as the world below her blurred into shadows and motion. The chaos of the crowd, the sobs, the shouts, the desperate prayers, faded until only her scope's narrow circle mattered. The rifle felt steady in her hands, its weight both foreign and familiar after years of disuse. She had not fired in combat for a long time, but as her finger rested against the trigger, her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. Through the crosshairs, she studied her first target. The gunman looming over the boy sneered as he jabbed his weapon toward the terrified child, shouting for the mother to quiet him. Saw the trembling of the woman's hands, the boy's wide eyes brimming with tears. If the gunman decided to make an example of them, the rest of the crowd would crumble in terror. Now she thought. She inhaled, let the breath settle deep in her chest, then released it slowly. Her heartbeat slowed to a rhythm she had mastered years ago. The world shrank to a single point, the rifle, her target, and the thin line between life and death. Her finger squeezed, smooth and deliberate. The crack of the rifle shattered the night. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the gunman dropped, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. Gasps erupted from the hostages. Mothers clutched their children, fathers stared in stunned disbelief. Even the other attackers froze, their eyes darting wildly, searching for the source of the shot. Didn't wait. She slid her body along the rooftop, shifting her angle. Never fire twice from the same spot. Hale's rule burned into her memory. She repositioned, exhaled again, and scanned for her next target. One of them barked frantic orders, raising his rifle toward the pavilion. His stance was aggressive, but his head turned too often as panic crept in. Steadied her crosshairs, found the weak point between his helmet strap and collar, and fired. He spun and collapsed. The attackers erupted into chaos. Some shouted into radios, others scanned the rooftops. To them, it was as if the night itself had turned against them. They weren't fighting townspeople anymore. They were fighting an unseen force. The hostages began to stir. Confusion turned to hope as they realized someone was protecting them. A father pulled his children behind a picnic table, whispering for them to stay low. A teenager scrambled for a gap in the fence, leading two younger kids to safety. Each second bought gave them more time to escape. She shifted again. Another target, another shot. Precision, not frenzy. Every pull of the trigger was deliberate, each round crippling the attacker's control without unnecessary bloodshed. She didn't aim for kill shots unless forced. A shattered rifle stock, a disabled shoulder, a leg wound was enough to turn the tide. From below, one of the men shouted, "Sniper! We've got a sniper!" Almost smiled. They were right, though they couldn't possibly know who it was. Panic rippled through the leader barked back commands, his voice straining to keep control. He pushed his men into formations, trying to shield themselves with the hostages. It was a calculated move, but also a fatal mistake. By bunching together, they became predictable. Adjusted, firing again. Another rifle fell uselessly from an attacker's hands. The once terrified townspeople now had courage sparked within them. They crawled, ran, and dragged each other toward cover. The more they moved, the harder it became for the attackers to maintain control. Knew she couldn't hold them off forever, not without backup, but she didn't need forever. She only needed enough time for reinforcements to arrive. Already, faint sirens howled in the distance, cutting through the humid night air. Her eyes locked on the leader. He barked into his radio, his frustration palpable, his head whipping in every direction. Steadied her rifle but didn't fire, yet, not until the moment was right. The people have had no idea that their lives balanced on the breath of the quiet woman on the rooftop. The first shot had shattered their fear. The battle was no longer hopeless. And Dawson had just begun. The echo of his rifle still lingered in the humid night air, but the fight was far from over. Below her, chaos pulsed through the pavilion like a storm. The attackers, once brimming with arrogance, now scrambled with desperation. Every shadow became a threat, every rooftop a possible hiding place for the sniper they couldn't locate. His eyes never left her scope for long. She shifted from one position to another, sliding across shingles, crawling behind ventilation ducts, her movements fluid and practiced. From childhood, Hale had drilled into her. A sniper lives because she doesn't stay still. Patience and movement, invisibility in plain sight. Through the crosshairs, she tracked the leader again. He had two men close to the center of the crowd, using the hostages as a human shield. His commands were sharp, panicked but loud, urging his men to stay close and drag families back into the open. But notice something he didn't. The crowd no longer obeyed in silence. A father had ushered his wife and son toward the side gate, crawling low behind overturned tables. Two teenagers guided an elderly woman toward the shadows of the parking lot. The courage of the townspeople was growing, fueled by the knowledge that someone above was protecting them. Steadied her scope on one of the who reached out to grab a fleeing child. She exhaled and fired. The man's arm snapped back, his rifle flying from his hands. He fell to the ground screaming, more in shock than pain. The child bolted free into his mother's arms, disappearing behind a stack of chairs. The crowd gasped again, but this time the sound carried hope instead of fear. The attackers fired wildly toward the rooftops, spraying bullets into the night sky. Shards of brick and glass splintered around's position, but she remained calm, already sliding away from where they aimed. She gritted her teeth and moved to the far side of the roof, keeping low. Sirens grew louder now, wailing through the distance. Knew she had to hold out just a few more minutes. If she could keep the hostages alive until then, trained tactical units would finish the job. Her scope found another target, a man shouting into his radio, trying desperately to call for backup. She squeezed the trigger, and his radio shattered into pieces, sparks raining over his vest. He cursed, slamming the useless device into the ground. "Sniper cutting us off," one of the men yelled. The leader's face contorted with rage. He grabbed a young woman by the hair, yanking her forward, pressing his pistol to her temple. He screamed into the night, demanding the sniper reveal themselves or he would execute her. The crowd froze, breaths held in terror. His heart hammered. This was the moment she dreaded most, when an innocent life became the bargaining chip. Hale's voice returned in her mind. Don't react to threats. Anticipate movements. A desperate man exposes himself when he believes he's in control. She steadied her breath, her crosshairs hovering over the thin strip of the leader's arm pressed against the woman's shoulder. The angle was unforgiving, but had taken harder shots in the desert years ago. Her finger curled. The crack rang out, sharp and final. The leader screamed as the bullet tore through his wrist, sending the pistol spinning into the dirt. The woman stumbled free, scrambling into the arms of other hostages who dragged her to safety. The leader clutched his shattered hand, blood pouring between his fingers, his control collapsing as his men shouted in confusion. The crowd erupted, not in panic but in defiance. They surged toward the fence, pushing children over, helping one another climb out. Some threw bottles, chairs, whatever they could grab, forcing the attackers to split their attention between the sniper above and the angry mass below. For the first time, the attackers looked small, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and hunted. His chest tightened with both adrenaline and relief. She knew the danger wasn't over. The men still carried rifles, still had the ability to slaughter, but their power was unraveling fast. Blue and red lights flickered in the distance, painting the horizon. The howl of sirens drew nearer, the pounding rhythm of boots closing in. Had done it, she had held the line long enough. But her role wasn't finished. She reloaded, eyes narrowing on the last pockets of resistance. The people of were almost free. And Dawson would see them through. The shrill wail of sirens filled the night air as the first squad cars screeched to a halt near Central Square. Red and blue lights flickered across the buildings, washing the chaos in pools in color. Officers spilled out, crouched low, rifles raised, shouting commands that cut through the tension like knives. The attackers froze. Their leader, clutching his bleeding wrist, barked at his men to hold the hostages. But the crowd no longer trembled like before. The townspeople had tasted hope, and hope was something no weapon could fully silence. From her rooftop, watched everything unfold through her scope. She spotted one of the younger attackers fumbling nervously with his rifle, his hands shaking as he tried to keep control of 3 terrified teenagers. His eyes darted toward the approaching police vehicles and could see it, fear, pure and raw. She steadied her crosshairs on the dirt beside him and squeezed. The bullet hit the ground inches from his boot, sending up a spray of dust. The boy dropped his rifle immediately, hands shooting into the air. The hostages bolted, sprinting toward the flashing lights where officers rushed forward to pull them to safety. "Sniper still up there," one of the men screamed. Lips pressed into a thin line. They were right, but by the time they figured out where she would already be gone. The leader staggered forward, fury twisting his face. He dragged another hostage to the center of the pavilion, holding a knife to the man's throat. Blood streaked down his forearm where his bullet had shattered bone, but his rage gave him strength. "Back off," he roared at the police, "or he dies, every last one of them dies." The square fell silent except for the wail of sirens and the shouts of officers trying to negotiate. The standoff hung on a knife's edge. Steadied her breath. She could feel the sweat dripping down her temples, soaking the fabric of her shirt. This was the final test, one shot to end it all, but it wasn't easy. The leader moved constantly, his hostage trembling in front of him, blocking most of the target. Knew a rushed shot could cost a life. She closed her eyes for a second, hearing Hale's voice again. "Trust the rhythm. Every man moves in a pattern, even if he doesn't know it. Wait for the opening the world gives you." Her eyes opened. She studied the leader's movements through the scope, back and forth, shifting his weight, shouting at the police. And then there. Each time he leaned to scream, his head tilted slightly away, exposing the line of his jaw. Exhaled. The shot cracked like thunder. The knife clattered to the ground. The leader collapsed to his knees, howling in pain as blood streamed from the graze along his jaw. The hostage stumbled free, sprinting toward the officers who surged forward to drag him behind cover. Move in," a commanding officer barked. Police stormed the square, rifles leveled, their boots thundering against the pavement. The attackers, already shaken, broke. Some dropped their weapons, hands raised high in surrender. Others tried to flee, only to be tackled and pinned by officers swarming in from every angle. Reloaded calmly, scanning for stragglers. One man bolted toward the fence, desperation in his stride. She fired low, the bullet shattering the ground in front of him. He froze, dropping to his knees just as two officers closed in. It was over. The pavilion that had moments before been a prison now erupted in cries of relief. Families clung to one another, children sobbed into their parents' arms, and the police the attackers into handcuffs. The nightmare had ended, though the echoes of fear still hung heavy in the air. From her rooftop, allowed herself a single deep breath. Her hands trembled now, not from fear but from release. She had done what she came to do. Yet as she watched officers secure the area, she knew she couldn't step forward and reveal herself. She wasn't a police officer, wasn't part of the town's story in the way they would soon tell it. To them, she would remain the invisible protector, the sniper they never knew existed. She slid back from the roof's edge, dismantling the rifle with practiced precision. The night air felt cool against her damp skin, carrying the faint cheers of the townspeople who believed the police had saved them. Knew the truth, and that was enough. The square was alive with sirens, shouts, and the sound of relief. Police secured the last of the attackers, their wrists bound tight in plastic restraints. Paramedics rushed in with stretchers, tending to the wounded and comforting the shaken. Families clung to each other, their cries no longer born of fear but of overwhelming gratitude. Crouched low on the rooftop, her rifle dismantled and stowed in the worn case she had carried for years. She watched the scene below like a ghost hovering over the living. Every part of her wanted to climb down, to reassure the townspeople that the stranger with the rifle had been watching over them. She wanted to hear the words of thanks, to see the recognition in their eyes. But she couldn't. Not because she didn't crave it, she did, but because she knew better. A sniper's value was in shadows, If she stepped into the light, the questions would come. Who trained her? Why had she never revealed her skills? What ghosts was she carrying from her past? Deserved their peace, not her secrets. So she stayed hidden, her breath steadying as the adrenaline drained from her body. Below, officers began piecing the story together. They must have panicked, one cop said, shaking his head. Something spooked them, forced their hand, gave us time to move in. The townspeople had their own theories. Some whispered that divine intervention had shielded them. Others swore they had seen sparks of light from the rooftops, proof that someone had been up there fighting for them. A child tugged at his father's sleeve and said, "It was an angel, Daddy, an angel with a rifle." Smiled faintly at that, though her eyes stung with the weight of it. She wasn't an angel. She was just a woman who couldn't forget what she'd been trained to do. She gathered her gear with practiced precision. Each motion calmed her, snapping the latches on the rifle case, tucking stray rounds into her pack, slipping on a dark jacket to conceal her silhouette. The rooftop that had been her battlefield minutes ago now became her escape route. She moved silently down a maintenance ladder at the far end of the building, slipping into the shadows of an alley. From there, she blended into the darkened streets, her pace steady but unhurried. No one noticed the lone woman walking away from the chaos, her face hidden beneath the brim of her cap. As she passed the library, she paused for a moment, listening to the distant hum of sirens behind her. The town had survived tonight. The people had fought back, found courage, and stood together. That was the legacy they would carry, not her name, not her face, but the knowledge that ordinary people could overcome fear when given a chance. Her mind drifted back to Hale. He would have told her she had done well, not just because she hit her targets, but because she had remembered the deeper lesson. A sniper protects life, not glory. Took a deep breath and turned toward the empty road that led out of town. She had no destination in mind. She never did. Wherever she went, she carried her past with her, the weight of her training balanced by the quiet redemption of nights like this. They would tell the story differently. The newspapers would praise the swift actions of the police, the bravery of the townspeople, and the miraculous way the attackers had lost control. Around dinner tables, parents would reassure their children that good had triumphed because their community stood strong. And maybe, in whispers, they would mention the rumor of a sniper, someone who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. An invisible guardian, a phantom savior. And for Dawson, that was enough. She disappeared into the night, leaving behind no name, no trace, only a story that would linger in for generations. The night they were saved by a stranger trained by a legend.